There is a photograph almost every American has seen, even if they never learned its name. A line of men in worn coats, shoulders pulled in against the cold, waiting outside a building with no sign, just a door. Somewhere behind them, a pot of soup. Nobody is smiling, nobody is looking at the camera. That single image has done more to teach Americans about the Great Depression than any classroom ever did. And it's real. That line existed. That hunger existed. That desperation existed. But here is the question almost nobody asks. What was happening 2 blocks away, out of frame, on the same afternoon, in the same city? A shopkeeper quietly extending credit to a family he'd known for 20 years. A rural household 3 counties over that never saw a soup line because there wasn't one for 100 miles, and the crisis showed up instead as a foreclosure notice nailed to a barn door. A domestic worker in the South, still going to work every day, still being paid almost nothing, watching a new government program get built that would never include her. The Great Depression didn't happen to America. It happened to millions of different Americas, all at once, in different ways, for different reasons, with different endings. Most of us didn't live through it, but we grew up inside its echo. A grandfather who never talked about money without lowering his voice. A grandmother who saved everything because she remembered when nothing could be replaced. We inherited the feeling of that decade before we ever learned its facts. And the facts we did learn came pre-packaged. A stock market crash, a president who did nothing, a president who fixed everything, a dust bowl that sent everyone west, a New Deal that saved the country. Half of that is true. All of it is incomplete. Somewhere between the classroom, the movie screen, and the story your grandmother told you at the kitchen table, the Great Depression got sanded down into something simpler than it ever was. Not falsified, just flattened. The rough, uneven, unequal truth of it got smoothed into a single narrative everyone could agree on, because a single narrative is easier to teach, easier to film, and easier to remember than 10 million different kitchens all struggling in 10 million different ways. This isn't a video about secrets. Nobody hid this from you. It's simply what happens when a decade this large gets compressed into a photograph, a paragraph, and a single word, depression, that has to carry the weight of everything that happened between 1929 and the years the country slowly climbed out. Tonight, we're going to widen the frame. Not to tear down what you already believe. Most of it holds up. But we're going to walk through 40 pieces of the popular story about the crash, about Hoover, about Roosevelt, about the New Deal, about who was helped and who was quietly left standing outside the door, and look at what the full picture actually shows. Some of what you learned was exactly right. Some of it was true for one family and false for the family next door. And some of it was a story that got repeated so many times by so many well-meaning voices that repetition started to feel like proof. By the end, the Great Depression won't look less real to you. It will look more human, more uneven, more honest about who it broke, who it spared, and who it simply never noticed at all. Start with the date everyone knows. October 29, 1929, Black Tuesday. The story most of us absorbed goes like this. The stock market crashed, and overnight, America went from champagne to breadlines. One day everyone was rich, the next day everyone was ruined. That version makes for a clean story. It is also mostly wrong about the everyone part. In 1929, only a small slice of the American population owned stock at all, a minority concentrated in cities, in certain professions, among people who had disposable income to invest in the first place. A farmer in Nebraska didn't lose his savings on Wall Street on October 29th because he never had savings on Wall Street to begin with. His crisis had already been building for most of the decade, through falling crop prices that started years before the crash made headlines. For millions of rural Americans, the Roaring Twenties everyone remembers as glamorous had never roared at all. It had been a slow, grinding decline that the crash simply made official. This is the first crack in the flattened version of the story. The crash didn't create the Depression out of nothing. For a huge portion of the country, it was the moment the rest of America finally noticed a crisis that had already been happening. And the crash itself gets misremembered too. The idea that stockbrokers leapt from windows by the dozen, that Wall Street was littered with bodies in the days after Black Tuesday, that image comes largely from rumor and later exaggeration, not from documented events. It made for vivid storytelling. It wasn't the reality of that week. Here's another piece worth widening. The crash is often taught as the single cause of the Depression, as though one bad October explains an entire decade of suffering. Historians who study the period point instead to a tangle of causes stacked on top of each other: bank structures with almost no safety net, uneven wealth distribution that left ordinary households without a cushion, agricultural overproduction that had already crushed farm income, and international economic strain following the First World War. The crash was the spark. It was not, by itself, the fire. But here is the part nobody likes to admit. Even the phrase, "the stock market crash caused the Depression," survived so long not because it was the most accurate explanation, but because it was the simplest one. A single dramatic day is easier to put in a textbook than a decade of interlocking economic weaknesses. The photograph got a caption. The caption became the lesson. Picture a small-town bank in early 1933. A line forms outside, not for soup, for money. Depositors trying to withdraw their own savings before the bank runs out. Multiply that scene across thousands of towns, and you get one of the least understood pieces of the whole decade. Over 9,000 banks failed during the early 1930s, and when they failed, ordinary depositors simply lost what they had put in. There was no insurance to protect them. That detail alone reframes a common myth, that people who lost everything were reckless speculators. Many of them were just people who had trusted a local bank with a paycheck. When the new administration declared a national bank holiday in March of 1933, closing every bank in the country for several days, the popular memory of that moment tends to compress it into a single heroic gesture. The government stepped in, and the crisis of confidence ended. The reality was slower and far less uniform. Banks didn't all reopen together. They were examined one by one, city by city, and only the ones judged stable were allowed to resume operating. Some never reopened at all. A family in one town might have had their bank back within the week. A family 2 counties over might have watched their bank stay shuttered for good, their savings gone with it. This next part sounds small, until you realize it held entire families together, or didn't. The difference between those 2 families wasn't effort, wasn't virtue, wasn't who worked harder. It was which bank examiner reached their town first, and what he found in the ledger. Every popular telling of the Depression needs 2 characters, a villain and a hero. Herbert Hoover plays the villain. He did nothing while the country suffered, the story goes. A cold and distant president who let people starve rather than lift a finger. Franklin Roosevelt plays the hero, arriving in 1933 to single-handedly fix everything the moment he took office. Neither character survives close contact with the record. Hoover did far more than the did-nothing version allows. His administration expanded public works spending, created a federal agency to extend loans to struggling banks and businesses, and pushed states to increase relief efforts. What Hoover refused to do was extend direct federal cash relief straight to individuals, a position rooted in a genuine, if ultimately inadequate, belief that local government, private charity, and voluntary cooperation should carry that weight, not Washington. It was a philosophy that failed the moment it met a crisis of this scale. But it was a philosophy, applied with real effort behind it, not indifference. The image of Hoover as a man who simply shrugged and let the country collapse says more about how badly a presidency can be remembered than about what that presidency actually did. And this is where the popular story gets its ending wrong too. Roosevelt did not end the Depression the moment he was inaugurated. Unemployment remained painfully high for years into his presidency. The economy improved unevenly, dipped again sharply in 1937 during what's now remembered as the Roosevelt recession, and the country did not fully climb out of the Depression's shadow until the industrial demands of the Second World War pulled the economy into a different gear entirely. Roosevelt's New Deal mattered enormously. It changed the relationship between government and citizen for good and gave millions of families relief they desperately needed. But Roosevelt fixed it is a caption, not a chronology. Even the phrase New Deal itself gets treated in popular memory as a single unified program, one clean policy rolled out overnight. It was closer to a decade of experimentation. Dozens of separate agencies and programs, some successful, some abandoned within a year or two, adjusted and rebuilt constantly as the administration learned, in real time, what was and wasn't working. The New Deal wasn't a blueprint. It was closer to a home being repaired room by room while the family still lived in it, patch by patch, some patches holding, some not. Ask most people what unemployment reached during the worst of the Depression, and you'll hear one number confidently repeated: 25%. It's not wrong, exactly. That figure is real, drawn from historical estimates for 1933. But treating it as a single national reality flattens something important. Unemployment wasn't evenly distributed at 25% from coast to coast. Industrial cities, dependent on manufacturing and steel, were sometimes hit far harder than that number suggests, with entire neighborhoods where most working-age men had no job at all. Some agricultural regions, meanwhile, saw a different kind of crisis. Not joblessness exactly, since farm families kept working their land, but a collapse in what that work was worth, families laboring just as hard as ever for income that had fallen by half or more. This is where the story stops being nostalgic and starts becoming uncomfortable. A single national percentage makes for a tidy headline. It erases the difference between a Detroit auto worker standing outside a shuttered factory and an Alabama sharecropper still working sunup to sundown for a fraction of what that labor used to bring home. Both were living through the Depression. Neither one's depression looked like the other's. There's a photograph, or rather, a category of photograph that almost never made it into the version of the Depression most Americans absorbed. Not the soup line, not the Hooverville, not the dusty road out of Oklahoma. The photograph that's missing is the one of a black sharecropping family in the rural South, working the same land they'd worked for a decade, watching federal agricultural programs designed to stabilize crop prices pay landowners for reducing production, while the sharecroppers and tenant farmers who actually worked that land, disproportionately black families across the South, were pushed off it entirely, with no compensation and nowhere built into the policy to catch them. This wasn't a hidden footnote. It was baked directly into how some of the era's signature agricultural policy operated in practice, even when it wasn't the stated intention on paper. A program built to help the farmer quietly excluded the people doing much of the farming, because the payments went to the landowner, and the landowner didn't always share. That same pattern showed up in another corner of the New Deal entirely, one we'll walk through in detail later, when we look at who Social Security was actually built to cover, and who it very deliberately left standing outside. For now, hold this thought: the popular memory of the Depression as a single shared national hardship, a moment when everyone was equally poor and it brought the country together, is one of the gentlest and most persistent myths of the entire decade. It's comforting because it suggests fairness in the suffering. The record tells a rougher story, one where the crisis hit hardest, exactly where protection was thinnest, and where the New Deal, for all it accomplished, often built its safety net with the same gaps that had always existed in American life, just newly formalized into law. We're only through the first 2 chapters. There's more ahead. The real math behind who Social Security left out, the actual road the Dust Bowl migrants traveled, and the everyday details of Depression-era life that popular culture simplified almost beyond recognition. Social Security is remembered, correctly, as one of the great achievements to come out of the Depression, the moment America decided that growing old shouldn't mean falling into poverty with no floor beneath you. That part of the story is true, and it deserves to be told with real respect. But the popular version tends to stop there, at the applause, without asking who was standing in the room when the doors first opened, and who was left outside them. When the Social Security Act passed in 1935, it excluded two entire categories of American workers from its protections: agricultural laborers and domestic workers. Farmhands, housekeepers, cooks, nannies, the people who worked the fields and the people who worked inside other families' homes were written out of the program at the moment of its creation. This wasn't an oversight buried in fine print. It was a known, negotiated exclusion, and it landed with devastating precision on Black Americans, who made up a large share of both agricultural and domestic labor in the 1930s, particularly across the South. A white factory worker in Cleveland could look forward to a Social Security check decades later. A Black woman who spent those same decades cooking and cleaning in someone else's home could not, because the law simply didn't count her work as work that qualified. Here is where the story stops being nostalgic and starts becoming uncomfortable, on purpose. This isn't a case where we need to imagine hidden racism behind a neutral policy. The exclusion of domestic and agricultural labor was debated openly at the time, and it survived the debate specifically because including those categories would have meant extending federal benefits to millions of Black workers in a political environment where that was considered unacceptable by powerful voting blocs in Congress. The New Deal is remembered as the moment government decided to protect ordinary Americans. For a large share of Americans, that protection had an asterisk attached to it from the very beginning. It would take decades, well into the 1950s, before those exclusions were gradually closed. For an entire generation of domestic and farm workers, that gap wasn't an abstraction. It was the difference between a retirement with some support and a retirement with none at all. A Depression-era policy did not stop mattering when the decade ended. It stayed in paychecks, in retirement funds, in who could afford to stop working and who couldn't, for 30 years afterward. The exclusions didn't stop at Social Security. Programs built to put people back to work, the ones remembered today through grainy photographs of men building dams, planting trees, laying roads, operated with real, if uneven, discrimination in how work was assigned, how much workers were paid in different regions, and who got hired in the first place. Some New Deal work programs paid Black workers less than white workers for the same labor in the same program. Some effectively excluded Black applicants from certain kinds of assignments altogether, especially in the South, where local administrators had significant control over who got called in and who didn't. None of this erases what these programs accomplished. Millions of families across every background were kept afloat by relief work during years when there was almost nothing else to hold on to. But the New Deal helped America is a sentence that needs an asterisk. The popular version rarely includes, it helped America unevenly, along the same fault lines that had always divided the country, sometimes narrowing them, and sometimes, quietly, keeping them exactly where they'd always been. Now to a piece of the story almost everyone thinks they know precisely, because a single novel and its film adaptation did more to shape the popular memory of the Dust Bowl than any history course ever could. The image, desperate Oklahoma farm families, driven off dust-choked land, piling everything they own onto a truck, and driving the length of Route 66 to California, where, eventually, after hardship, they build new lives. Some of that happened. Much of what surrounds it didn't happen the way the popular version suggests. Start with geography. The Dust Bowl itself was concentrated in a specific region, parts of Oklahoma, Texas, Kansas, Colorado, and New Mexico, where a combination of drought and agricultural practices that had stripped away the native prairie grass turned topsoil into airborne dust on a scale that blotted out the sun in some storms. But the migrants who left the region for California during the 1930s were not. Contrary to the popular shorthand, Okies, overwhelmingly Dust Bowl farmers fleeing dust storms. Many were people from a broader stretch of the southern plains and beyond, leaving for the same underlying reason: collapsed agricultural income that had been building for years, but not necessarily because their own specific farm had been buried. And here's the detail that reorders the whole picture. Most people affected by the Dust Bowl did not leave for California at all. The overwhelming majority stayed in the region, adapting, moving to nearby towns, waiting out the drought, rebuilding what they could on the same land. The dramatic westward migration was real and significant. Several 100,000 people made that journey over the course of the decade, but it was never close to a majority movement of everyone the Dust Bowl affected. The people who stayed simply didn't make it into the photograph, because staying put doesn't make for a compelling road story. And for those who did make the journey west, California wasn't the promised land the ending of the popular story implies. Migrant families arriving in the Central Valley often found themselves in makeshift camps with brutal conditions, facing open hostility from local communities and law enforcement who viewed them as unwelcome competition for scarce agricultural work. Wages for farm labor in California during this period were often desperately low, driven down further by the sheer number of displaced workers competing for the same jobs. Some families did eventually establish stable lives in California over the following years. Many others spent the rest of the decade in a cycle of seasonal farm labor that looked less like a rival and more like an extension of the same instability they'd left behind. This is not about tearing down a story that moved millions of readers and viewers. The hardship in that story was real, and it was drawn from real accounts. But treating one novel's ending as historical fact, the idea that the journey west resolved into stability, smooths over just how long and uneven the actual recovery was for the families who made that drive. The last stretch of myths lives closer to the ground, in daily life, in the small assumptions that built up around the era, through decades of movies, sitcoms, and family stories passed down secondhand. One persistent idea: that the entire country wore the same gray, threadbare uniform of poverty for 10 straight years, every household equally scraping by. In reality, even during the worst years of the Depression, the majority of American households remained employed, even if wages were often lower and job security was thinner than it had been in the 1920s. The Depression was a crisis that touched nearly everyone in some way, through a relative out of work, through prices, through fear of what might come next. But it did not mean universal destitution. Plenty of families experienced real hardship without experiencing the soup-line poverty that has become shorthand for the entire decade. Another, that prohibition, banned throughout the early Depression years, meant alcohol simply vanished from American life until its repeal in 1933. In practice, illegal production and distribution continued at enormous scale throughout the period, and the repeal of prohibition in the middle of the Depression was itself partly an economic decision, a chance to legally tax and regulate an industry rather than watch it operate entirely underground. Another, that the era's most famous relief programs put people to work on projects of little lasting value, make-work jobs invented simply to keep men occupied. Much of the infrastructure built during this period, bridges, schools, parks, water systems, post offices, remained in daily use by American communities for generations afterward, well into the lifetimes of viewers watching this video right now. And one more, closer to home, the idea that every Depression-era household was equally devoted to thrift and self-sufficiency out of some shared national virtue. The truth is closer to necessity dressed up, decades later, as virtue. Families who saved string, reused flour sacks as clothing, and stretched a single chicken across 3 dinners weren't demonstrating a philosophy. They were responding to a specific, brutal math. Replacement wasn't guaranteed, credit wasn't always available, and waste wasn't a moral failing so much as something the household simply could not survive. The habits looked like character. Underneath, they were often just arithmetic with no other option. That same arithmetic is exactly what shaped the household so many of us grew up in. Not because our parents or grandparents necessarily lived through the worst of the 1930s themselves, but because the habits that decade forced into being didn't disappear when the economy recovered. They stayed in kitchens, in closets, in the way a mother eyed a grocery list, for years, sometimes for the rest of a lifetime. We've now walked through the crash, the men in charge, the safety net that had holes sewn into it on purpose, and the road west that never quite finished the way the story promised. 40 pieces of the popular narrative, widened rather than erased. What's left is not a depression that looks less real. It's one that looks less like a single photograph, and more like the 10 million different rooms that photograph never showed. So where does that leave the photograph we started with? The line of men in worn coats, waiting outside a door with no sign. It's still true. Nothing in the last 40 minutes makes that image less real, or less important. That line existed. That hunger existed. Somebody's grandfather may have stood in exactly that line, on exactly that kind of gray afternoon, waiting for a bowl of soup that had to count as dinner. What's changed, hopefully, is everything around the edges of that frame. The photograph was never a lie. It was just one room in a very large house. 2 blocks away, a shopkeeper was quietly extending credit. 3 counties over, a family was watching their bank stay closed for good. In the rural South, a domestic worker was watching a new safety net get built without her in mind. On a dusty road that never made it into the famous novel's ending, thousands of families were living out years of instability that the popular story simply didn't have room to tell. The Great Depression wasn't one story. It was millions of them, running at the same time, in different directions, with different endings, some hopeful, some never fully resolved. The version most of us inherited, through a grandparent's kitchen table retelling, a classroom film strip, or a movie that won every award it was nominated for, wasn't wrong so much as it was necessarily small. A decade that large will always get compressed the moment it's handed down. That's not deception. That's just what happens to history once it has to survive being remembered by people who weren't there. And maybe that's the real inheritance worth sitting with tonight. Not the myths themselves, but what they reveal about how memory works. The families who lived through those years didn't experience a single depression. They experienced their own kitchen, their own street, their own bank, their own crop, their own chance or lack of chance at the programs meant to help. What got passed down to us was never the whole decade. It was whichever room our own family happened to be standing in. They were poor, in many of those rooms. But room by room, family by family, they were rarely as helpless as the flattened version of the story sometimes suggests. They adapted to a bank holiday that didn't reopen their bank. They kept farming land that a policy quietly excluded them from being paid for. They rebuilt after a dust storm instead of boarding a truck west. They raised children who grew up to raise children of their own, some of whom are watching this video right now, still turning over a grandmother's habit, a grandfather's silence about money, wondering exactly what decade that came from. Now you know a little more precisely which room it came from. If this widened the picture for you, if even one of these 40 pieces reshaped something you thought you already understood, subscribe to the Depression-era home, like this video, and tell us in the comments which part surprised you most. Maybe it's the bank holiday that didn't happen all at once. Maybe it's Social Security's excluded workers. Maybe it's the road west that so many families never actually finished. And if you know someone who grew up hearing the shorter version of this story, a parent, a grandparent, a teacher who taught it the way it was taught for decades, consider sharing this with them, not to prove the old story wrong, just to make the room a little bigger.